Hi, my name's Harris Bard for Pondlife Aquatics and Tropical Fish London, and in today's video, a new series called Back to Basics, where I'll be covering the basics of fish keeping. And in today's video, I'm going to be covering everything to do with aquatic plants. Let's get into it. To begin with, I think it's important to establish why it's a good idea to be keeping aquatic plants. And one of the main reasons is purely for the aesthetic benefits of having a beautifully planted aquascaped aquarium. There's plenty of different kinds of plants, from floating plant to stem planting to rhizome plants, and even emerged planting out of aquariums. They range in all different kinds of colors, from your beautiful deep greens of Amazon sword, to your reds of Ultraranthia cardinalis, to your almost brown coloration of things like Cryptocorin wendetti brown. Having a variety of different plants in your aquarium can give a sense of depth and nature that is just stunning to look at, and it's hugely beneficial for the overall aesthetic feel of your aquarium. The second reason I think you should be keeping aquatic plants is for the overall health benefits to your aquarium that aquatic plants give you. Lots of aquarium planting has a hugely denitrifying effect on the water column. All aquarium planting will feed largely off of things like nitrates, which in high doses can be damaging to your fish and your shrimp. So by keeping a large amount of aquatic planting, you reduce the risk of nitrified poisoning to any of your fish species. Additionally, having loads of aquatic planting will help your aquarium find a more natural balance in terms of its nitrates, which will hugely reduce the risk of algal blooms. A lot of the time when you see people with huge algae outbreaks in their aquariums, they oftentimes don't have a good balance of dense planting that is a mixture of fast and slow aquatic growth, alongside a good light and potentially some fertilization, but I'll get into that later on. The oxygenation effects of a lot of aquatic planting also can't be understated. Particularly stem planting produces lots of oxygen for your aquarium. You can see this in aquatic plants that pearl, where they will actually produce little bubbles on their leaf that drift towards the surface. This increases the oxygen count in your aquarium and can reduce the risk of suffocation for a lot of fish species. It's why I always recommend to our customers here that even if they want a bare base aquarium with very little planting, they always have something in there, whether that be a bunch of najas or some beautifully planted wood. Another huge benefit to having aquatic planting is that it gives natural cover for a lot of aquatic species. Obviously, there are some species of fish that can't have dense planting. For example, things like uaru that will pretty much eat any kind of aquatic plant. But for a lot of nanofish species, having dense planting, or even any planting at all, can offer a natural hide space that will make them feel a lot less stressed. This is particularly important for fish that can sometimes be a little bit more on the timid side. Giving them lots of spaces to hide will actually give you a better display of how your fish would be in their natural environment. That leads me on to the final reason why I think keeping aquatic plants is hugely beneficial is that it really does mimic a lot of species' natural environments. Although there are plenty of species that live in blackwater aquatics where there will be very little light, lots of debris, lots of leaf litter inside of their natural environments, there will always be things like Anubias growing on the banks of a river, or Cryptocorin growing in darker spots that obviously don't get as much light. Giving species that tend to live in environments that aren't naturally planted up as heavily, at least some aquatic plants will 9 times out of 10 give them a much less stressful and a much better life when keeping them in your aquariums. Now, when we talk about aquarium planting, we're usually talking about 3 main varieties. We're either talking about stem planting, so things like Vallisneria, Ultraranthia cardinalis, Rotala rotundifolia, things that have roots that need to be planted into a substrate typically. These are either found in bunches that are wrapped in a foam with a lead weight. This is typical for things like Alodia densa. Some Vallisneria species is probably the most common for Vallisneria to be sold in bunches. You can also find it for a lot of other stem planting. The most common way that you will see stem planting sold in the aquarium trade is 5 centimeter potted plants. These are usually wrapped in a sort of floss, which the plants will be rooted into. And when you are planting them into your aquarium, you will have to remove them from the pots, remove the floss, and then plant the roots directly into the substrate. This goes the same for your bunch planting. Although some people do like to keep the weights on, I personally prefer to remove the weights and the foam and then plant directly into soil, as it doesn't restrict the root growth nearly as much, and you will get better growth out of your plants. The second group of plants that are most common in the aquarium trade are something called epiphytes. This tends to be your Anubias, your Bucephalandra, and Java fern. There's obviously other epiphytes, but these are characterized by plants with a rhizome that typically need to be attached to something. That's either small rocks, large rocks, pieces of wood, and they are very common to be sold as a low lighting alternative. We sell loads of epiphytes in our store. We typically sell them attached to wood. We occasionally get things like Anubias attached to things like lava rock, but largely it is planting that is attached to bogwood. I'll do another episode on different types of hardscape, but know for now that most epiphytes are extraordinarily easy to grow. They need low light and are pretty much friendly for any level of fish keeper. I've seen them used in very low-tech aquariums with just a simple light, no filter, no heater, just kept in a temperate space. And I've also seen them kept in extraordinarily high-tech aquariums with all of the gubbins from CO2, highlighting, and daily fertilization. Epiphytes can survive and thrive throughout any of these, which can't be said the same for a lot of rooted plants, which tend to need higher lighting and sometimes some CO2 supplementation and fertilization. The third and final type of plant that you will typically see in the aquarium trade is floating plant, whether that be Amazon frogbit, duckweed, or redroot floater. These plants are extraordinarily easy to grow as long as you haven't got a huge amount of flow in your aquarium. They're hugely beneficial as they sit on the surface of the aquarium and have a hugely denitrifying effect. If you are someone who suffers in your aquarium with lots of algae and lots of issues with high nitrites and nitrates, potentially adding in something like a floating plant will help bring all of those readings down and can really just be something quite beautiful to add to any aquarium. These are typically sold in portions or pots, and it easily replicates and is probably one of the easiest species of plants that you can grow on your own at home. Although I did talk about the three main ways that we sell plants here at Pondlife Aquatics and in general in the aquarium trade, of potted, bunched, and attached to various pieces of bogwood or hardscape, there is something that is making a bit of a rise in the aquarium trade and has become very widely available in the past 5 years or so, and that is in vitro cups. This is storage in repens, so a stem plant that is grown in vitro. This means that it's grown in a nutritive gel, which means that it has never been grown in an aquarium itself, which means you don't run the risk of bringing in things like swim bladder snails or other pests that can typically travel over from other aquariums with things like stem plants, bunch plants, potted plants, floating plants, and epiphytes. I personally used in vitro pots for one of the first scapes I ever did for this channel, and I found it a hugely rewarding way of growing planting on. Seeing plants go from literally their baby forms, as a lot of in vitro plants are very, very young, to growing into fully fledged, beautiful plants is really quite rewarding. That being said, because they are quite immature in terms of being exposed to anything in the actual aquarium, they can sometimes be a little bit temperamental. I found that my storage in repens, not this one, I'd used a Tropica variant, didn't do too well when I put it into an aquarium initially. However, I have had huge success with my things like Rotala, rotundifolia, bloody red, and that may be due to having a better light and CO2 injection in that aquarium rather than in vitro in itself. However, it is something to bear in mind. Now let's get on to the basic needs of aquatic plants. The main one is light. It's something that's becoming more commonplace in the aquarium trade, where aquatics companies will actually give you something called the PAR rating, which is effectively how good the light is at growing plants. I know Superfish in particular have implemented this on the box of pretty much their entire range, showing on their starter tanks something like 167 PAR rating, all the way up to their scaper tanks that run at 276 PAR, which is pretty much perfect for growing any high light requirement planting. It's something to bear in mind when setting up an aquarium to begin with, how good the kit light is and which plants you want to keep. It's absolutely fine to start out an aquarium using a budget starter kit that has a relatively poor light, as long as you're willing to only grow low light aquatic plants. Things like Java Fern, Cryptocorinne, Anubias, anything. Most epiphytes will be absolutely fine in very low light aquariums, and a lot of Cryptocorinne species will also be absolutely fine when you have them in lower lighting conditions. That being said, if you can get a better light when starting out keeping aquatic plants for the first time, it will completely transform what you can keep. You won't just be limited to low lighting planting, and you'll be able to keep some of the truly stunning colored plants like your red Rotala rotundifolias or your Ultrantha cardinalis. An important factor to consider when wanting to start an aquarium with aquatic plants is what substrate you're going to use. A common mistake I see when people set up an aquarium for the first time is they want to just use a plain gravel or sand, which is fine if you supplement that with something like a NutriCap soil fertilizer, where you put a cap full of nutrients into your sand or gravel and then plant a plant directly over the top of it. The issue that people run into is that sand and gravel don't have any nutritive benefits or very little, which means that plants do not have sufficient nutrients to grow, particularly if you're not supplementing with fertilizers, and a lot of their plants will melt and die when first going into the aquarium, and then they'll bounce off wanting to keep live planting because they can't seem to keep it alive. By picking something like an aquascaper soil, which is a highly nutritive soil, or a tetra substrate capped off with something like sand, not only will a lot of substrates buffer your pH lower, which is hugely beneficial for a lot of aquarium planting and a lot of aquarium fish, they'll offer a soft substrate with lots of nutrients that means that you can grow beautiful, strong and healthy, particularly stem planting. If, however, stem planting isn't for you and you want to go largely for epiphytes, I would actually steer away from keeping a substrate, and I would mainly supplement with something like a fertilizer into the water column itself, as epiphytes typically won't root into the soil. So it's important to make sure that there is enough nutrients in the water column, whether that be through stocking of fish or through artificial supplementation with something like leaf sown or Evolution Aqua, the aquascaper. But I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Now, it would be impossible to talk about aquatic planting without mentioning CO2. CO2 injection is something that when I was younger was relatively rare. It meant slugging a large bottle of CO2 and having a regulator with a solenoid valve on it that would inject CO2 into the water that you would then need to monitor to make sure that you didn't get a carbonic acid spike that would kill all your fish. Nowadays, keeping CO2 injection is very, very easy. There's relatively inexpensive CO2 injection kits, whether that be through bio-CO2, like the Denali CO2 Carbobel Star 120, which I set up on the first aquascape I did on this channel, or through having a regulator with a solenoid valve. I personally like using ones that can attach to SodaStream, as the bottles are inexpensive and really easy to get a hold of rather than having to go somewhere to get a CO2 refill. Effectively, what having CO2 does reduces the limiting factor of photosynthesis, meaning that a lot of plants will suddenly take off in growth. When I say limiting factor, I literally mean the thing that is stopping the plant from growing at its fastest rate. If you have the best light in the world, an amazing substrate, and you are fertilizing, it doesn't matter how good all of those things are. If you haven't got CO2 injection to then take away the photosynthetic limit, you're never going to get the absolute most growth out of your aquatic plants. This is particularly indicative when you have plants like Rotala rotundifolia bloody red, or Taranthera cardinalis, or Ludwigia plastris diamond red. To get those truly deep red colorations out of your plants, CO2 injection is a must-have. Fertilizing your aquatic plants is something that a lot of people will actually steer away from completely. Now, personally, I've spent times where I have gone through hardcore fertilization with lots of CO2 injection, where I will be dosing with fertilizer every single day, a certain amount. This can either be done manually with a teat pipette, or you can do it using something like a dosing pump. A dosing pump is effectively an automatic dosing of a liquid into the aquarium, automated to be once a day, twice a day, or 3 times a day. Effectively, what fertilizers do is put macro and micronutrients of different varieties that your plants need to feed on. I could go into all of the macro and micronutrients and specifics of why they're important, like ferrous being important for your deep reds and not getting holes in your leaves. However, I feel like that is a lot more advanced, and I'll do that in a future video if anyone's interested. What you need to know for now is that there are largely 2 or 3 different kinds of fertilizers. The first one is a weekly fertilizer. These are obviously things that need to be dosed weekly. You have daily fertilizers, things like the Aquascaper by Evolution Aqua, and these are really nutrient-dense fertilizers that if you are going to use them, can sometimes cause algae blooms just because they add so much nutrients into the aquarium, and it's important to experiment with how much you use. I would always dose low initially to see how your aquarium reacts to it, so that you can then up the dose if you want more aggressive growth, or if you're getting good growth, just leave it where it is. I feel like a lot of people are afraid of fertilizing their aquariums, feeling like they will overdose and kill their fish. I would like to say it is quite difficult to do that. And if it's something that you've never done before and you want to give a go, be experimental with it. As long as you're not using 2, 3, or 4 times the dose of the recommended amount, you're not going to have any issues while dosing fertilizers. And it's something that you should do if you want to explore bigger and better plant growth. There are some in-between fertilizers that need to be done every 3 to 4 days. Those tend to be like things like Seachem Flourish. However, I've experimented with them before previously, and I actually find that using a smaller dose every day works much better than allowing that 3-day spike and dip. I will say in this section that using something like Seachem Flourish Excel, which is a liquid carbon, can hugely benefit a lot of people's aquariums. I personally recommend Seachem Flourish Excel to a lot of people because it's relatively inexpensive and actually has an algicide in it. So as you are dosing your plants with something that is going to reduce the limiting factor of their photosynthetic growth, you're actually killing off algae at the same time, which is obviously hugely beneficial for a lot of people for very obvious reasons. As a side note, it is also one of the best ways of killing off blackbeard algae if you spot dose with something like Flourish Excel. I'm aware that talk about CO2 injection and fertilizer puts some people off. So I want to use this final section of the video to talk about my recommendations for beginner, easy to grow, friendly planting. I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail because I do want to keep this really basic. If I was going to recommend any plants to beginner fish keepers who've never kept planting before, don't want to worry about a nutrient-dense substrate, they don't want to worry about CO2, they don't want to worry about fertilizers, what would I recommend to them? Personally, I would recommend something like hornwort, which is a stem plant which actually floats in the water column. It's extraordinarily easy to keep. You don't need to fertilize for it. Most lighting will be absolutely sufficient, and it will give huge amounts of growth and cover for pretty much any fish. The second plant I'd recommend is Java fern. This can be attached to any sort of hardscape, whether that be an artificial piece, if that's something that you like, rock or wood. The same again goes for something like Anubias. Anubias is a stunning species of plant and comes in all different shapes and sizes and is extraordinarily easy to grow. And finally, I would recommend people to keep moss balls. Moss balls are small and beautiful, really easy to grow, and can be thrown into pretty much every aquarium, and nobody should be having any difficulty with them. If you do want to keep aquatic plants for all of their health benefits and their visual attractiveness that I mentioned earlier, keeping any of the plants that I've mentioned densely will absolutely improve the quality of your water, the beauty of your aquarium, and happiness of your fish. If you have any questions about if a plant is easy to grow or not, please don't hesitate to comment below. I love giving people advice on plants. It's one of my favorite things, but I do want to keep this relatively basic for this video. And that's it for the first back to basics video from Pondlife Aquatics and Tropical Fish London. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me talk about all things aquatic plants, and I hope that I haven't confused anyone too much with too much jargon and wordiness. If there's anything in particular that you would like to know about keeping aquatic plants, don't hesitate to comment below. I will get back to you as soon as I can. If you would like to buy some aquatic plants, we deliver throughout the UK. All of the plants that I have mentioned today that we have in stock are available on our online store, and you can buy them using the link below. If you buy a plant from us because you watch this video, just drop a comment saying that you did and which plant you bought, and I will write a little handwritten note to say thank you for watching the video, for supporting us and everything we do here at Pondlife Aquatics and Tropical Fish London. Let me know what you would like to see next from Back to Basics, but for now, that's everything from me. My name is Harris Bard, and I hope you'll join me again next time for this Pond Life.